Hello everyone, Screenplay Archaeology host KiramidHead here. Before we get into today's episode, I just want to get some intro stuff out of the way. First things first, we are now part of the Fandom Lim Media podcast network, so I'm going to link their site down below. And that's why you would have just heard a promo for another podcast, because they're another one of the shows on the network. And as per usual, if you like the show and you'd like to know more, you can check out our social media pages on Facebook, Tumblr, Twitter, and even Instagram now. The show also has a Patreon if you're willing to gift money, but you don't really need to if you don't want to. And we also have a Discord server, which you can join if you want to chat with, the group members there. So that link is going to be down below as well. So yeah, sit back, guys, and enjoy the show. Alright everyone, hello and welcome to a new episode of the Screenplay Archaeology podcast. I am your host, KiramidHead, and today I am bringing you at long last another episode. My apologies, I had something lined up for October. All the notes were taken down, everything was ready, and then the schedule just exploded and we couldn't make it work. So that didn't end up happening then like it should have. And then I ended up wasting time throughout late October and all through November and most of December, not actually doing anything but prepping for a new episode. So you have my apologies. And so tonight I'm bringing you an episode based on Gladiator 2, the old unused version by Nick Cave that is infamous and well known online. And I figured finally I might as well give my take on it since we now have an actual Gladiator 2 that came out last month. And this one, of course, has a much different story to it. And just to give a quick synopsis off the bat before I delve into some background on this. Basically, the story is it picks up kind of where the first Gladiator leaves off. Maximus awakes in the afterlife, and it's this kind of sodden hellhole. He goes in search of his deceased wife and child, and ends up running into the Roman gods, one of whom sends him back to Earth, where he gets involved in the conflict between the Romans and the newly sort of, not really new because it's been a couple centuries by this point, but the upstart Christian community in Rome and the conflict between those two. Maximus ends up playing a key role. And a whole lot of weird shit happens. I'll leave it at that for now. Now, the history of this one is interesting because Gladiator is one of those movies which, as much as I love it and as good as it is, it's almost kind of an accident that turned out as well as it did because Ridley Scott and Russell Crowe were not happy with the script. And you go back and read the scripts, like the David Franzoni first draft is okay at best, and the John Logan rewrite really isn't that much better. And apparently Ridley Scott and Russell Crowe looked at that rewrite and then hacked it down to the parts they liked, and it was only about 35 pages. And so they bring in William Nicholson to write a new draft, and at the same time they go into production and they start making stuff up on set, big emotional beats, like those two figurines of his wife and child. That was just something Russell Crowe did on set. He just picked out two props from a whole bunch of them, and that became a whole big theme in the movie, and it ended up being the sort of ending note of the film, which in itself was an accident because they had to replace the original ending because Oliver Reed died. And so yeah, it's a great movie. It's got its problems. If Deus Deacon was here, he'd be talking about the Zulu chant during the battle scene at the beginning. But it's a great movie. It's this well-executed revenge movie, period piece. A lot of good action, some great memorable lines, great scenes, great characters. It's a movie that just somehow works, even if it does the thing that I always find funny in these old movies, where all the people in the back can somehow hear what he's saying, especially in that provincial arena where these guys are all up on a hill way in the background. I'm like, how are they hearing what he's saying to them? That always makes me laugh in movies like this when that happens. But yeah, that was a good movie. Now, the Gladiator 2 we did get, I've only seen once. I don't have as strong of a footing on it as I do of the first one yet, because I've only seen it the one time. My bare thoughts are that it's pretty good, but not great. It's a film that feels like there's maybe a great movie in there, as is often true with some Ridley Scott movies. It feels like there's a ton of stuff left on the cutting room floor. And it turns out his initial rough cut at least was 3 hours and 40 minutes long, and the version we have is 2.5, and it just feels like there's like character development missing from the movie. Like the main guy Lucius, especially, like Paul Mescal's doing a great job, but it feels like a lot of his character is left on the cutting room floor. Pedro Pascal's character Acacius, a lot of his stuff is on the cutting room floor, and I swear he's present in the flashback scenes, but you don't really see his face. You can only just hear his voice. I swear he's in the one flashback, and that there's more to his stuff there. As it is, he's just kind of there in the movie. Like Pedro Pascal kind of deserved better. The only character who seems to have come through intact through the editing process is Denzel Washington's Macronus, because you get every big moment with him throughout the entire movie, whereas everybody else feels like they're missing something. He has all the pieces in place. And the crazy emperors, too, they're interesting characters once you start getting a little bit more of them in the second half of the movie. But so much of their screen time is just them being crazy and weird that when they try and do character stuff later, it feels like you're missing the setup for it. But I'd say overall, it's still a good movie. It's Ridley Scott's second best film of the 2020s, coming after, of course, The Last Duel. Which, I mean, that's only 4 films so far, so that wouldn't be much of a ranking. So I'm not going to give you my whole list, but I put it second place, just under Last Duel. Last Duel is incredibly good. It's definitely, I'd say it's definitely a step or two above Gladiator 2. Like, Gladiator 2, it's a fun little action epic that could be better. And so this movie has this weird development history where they were like trying to do this forever because Gladiator 1 was a huge hit, probably more so than they were expecting. And so, as early as 2001, they were talking about doing a sequel, getting David Franzoni to maybe come back and do a sequel script. And it's like, but they're like, the whole big problem they had was that their star dies in the first movie because Maximus dies at the end. So, how are we going to get Russell Crowe back? And then eventually, around 2002, 2003, John Logan gets brought in to write the script. And his version, apparently based on the articles I've read, I can't find the source for this part anymore, but I remember reading it years ago. His version would have been called Blood of the Empire. And reading articles now, not only would have been following Lucilla's son Lucius as an adult, it would have been him trying to seek out the truth of who his real father was, and the twist would have been Maximus, which is something they did eventually go with in Gladiator 2, but it's one of those things that always feels weird because they never go there in the first movie. Like, you feel like they're kind of maybe hinting towards something of like, because they talk around Maximus and Lucilla having had this previous relationship in the movie without ever actually directly addressing it too much. And so it's one of those weird unspoken things where it is kind of weird that both their sons are apparently the exact same age, and it never comes up. But I always thought it was just a weird kind of retcon to put in there. And it's very strange in the movie because, like, I mean, this would mean nothing to Lucius. Maximus was just a guy he met once for like 5 minutes, like 20 years ago. So it's like, why should he care? He's long past care. And so that's just a very funny thing to me. And so, but apparently it also would have been part prequel, part sequel, and they would have found a way to resurrect Maximus because Russell Crowe was like looking into like Roman beliefs about the afterlife, even back in 2002. And then apparently, according to Ridley Scott in 2003, the script was completed. And he confirmed that, yes, it would mainly focus on Lucius as a character. And just looking at this development history here, it's like, apparently that version also had the Praetorian Guards ruling Rome, among other things. I'd like to read that because John Logan, even though I just said I didn't think his Gladiator draft was that great, he is a very good writer some of the time. I do wonder if between 2002 and 2003, if they were like, yeah, we don't know if we want the writer of Star Trek Nemesis, which was a huge bomb, to be writing Gladiator 2. Maybe that's what killed it. But then you get to 2005, I guess it would have been like 2005, 2006, because the script's undated. DreamWorks Pictures, they wanted to make the sequel, but there were all these ideas for the story, and apparently the studio wanted to do a Lucius story, but Russell Crowe wanted to bring Maximus back to life with a fantasy element, and that's where you get Nick Cave, who's famous sort of Australian rock star. He's friends with Russell Crowe, and he's also written movies. He wrote I believe like his 2 produced credits. Maybe he has a couple more I don't know about, but actually, let me just open this Wikipedia page instead of bullshitting so I can get my actual information. Yes, he wrote an Australian Western called The Proposition, which I finally saw like a year and a half ago. Great fucking movie. Bleak, but really good. And then he also ended up doing that movie Lawless, which apparently that one got kind of watered down by the studio, and he wasn't very happy with how that one turned out. he wasn't very happy with how that movie turned out. And that kind of turned him off screenwriting. At one point, he was in line to work on the Crow remake. Like he was one of the first guys attached to it, along with Stephen Norrington, who was going to direct. I'd love to read that script going off of this Gladiator 2 idea. I can only imagine him taking some of this kind of craziness and applying it to the Crow. That would at least be interesting. More interesting than what I'm hearing about the movie they finally put out. But, that is what it is. And so the story of how he came to write this is that he was friends with Russell Crowe. Russell Crowe said, "Hey, we're talking about doing a sequel to my movie Gladiator." And then Nick Cave said, "Yeah, but didn't you die in that movie?" He goes like, "You work it out." And so he goes off and writes the script. Now there's apparently that's how Nick Cave tells it. Ridley Scott tells it that he came up with this whole idea of it opening up with Maximus by the river Styx and all that, which that's not exactly what's in the script, but that's kind of what it is. And he also apparently came up with a very specific idea later in this, which I'll get to when that scene comes up. So I don't really know what's going on there. So yeah, we're going to get into the script, which is just titled Gladiator 2. Even though Nick Cave said he wanted to call it Christ Killer, that's not actually on the script, and that's not as literal as it might sound. I'll talk about what that might mean as we get into the script, as we get towards the end, and I'll start speculating about what's actually going on during a scene near the end, but I'll talk about that later because that's probably like a symbolic representation of something. And so this is a script which it's relatively short at 102 pages. It's pretty sparsely but well written. I mean, it's very clear as to what's going on in most scenes. But yeah, it's simply just called Gladiator 2 with an Arabic 2 instead of a Roman numeral. So we're not in Rocky territory yet, like we are in the movie. But so to get to the script, so it opens on a rainy field as two thieves come upon Maximus lying in the grass and steal his breastplate and sword before play fighting. And one of them is struck down by a spear, and the other flees as a mysterious figure named Mordecai appears. Maximus awakes, and Mordecai dodges his questions about where they are, but tells him his name and that he keeps the peace. Now, I'm Mordecai, I keep the peace here. And so they depart, taking shelter under a rock face where Mordecai tells Maximus he watched him kill the emperor in the Colosseum and saw him die, but I was there, but nobody could see me, which that gets explained a little later. Also, Mordecai could do as being a little bit more direct in what he's saying, because I mean he seems to be trying to impart some kind of advice to Maximus at times in this, but he always seems to be supremely unclear about what he means, which is like kind of not doing yourself any favors there, dude. And so Maximus, he drinks like a sip of like the wine that Mordecai gives him. He passes out, so I'm wondering, is it supposed to be drugged? And so he dreams of the wheat fields outside his home where his wife Maria and son Marius, so they get names in this version, are waiting for him before it starts to rain and lightning splits the poplar tree outside the gate in half. So it's taking his happy visions of his family from the first movie and putting a darker spin on them, which I have a theory about that, which it's never actually said, but I do have a theory about his visions of his family and how it relates to this story. I'll talk about that a little bit later. But that's another thing we have to put a pin in and get back. And so he awakes, once again asking Mordecai where they are, and the man just walks him up a hill, telling him he should give up searching for Elysium as that quest is hopeless. And they should have told that to Matt Damon. They reach the top of the hill, revealing a massive refugee camp on the shores of a Black Sea. And according to Mordecai, they're all backed up here because something has changed and is causing the order to shift. And he specifically says that this could just be one of many places just like this, which makes me wonder about different sort of mythological underworlds. Maybe they all exist in the same plane, so to speak. Or maybe that's just their way of saying even back then the world was a big fucking place. And so Mordecai, two women just start fucking catfighting. And he just interrupts them and explains to Maximus he has a minor rank here and helps keep the peace in exchange for short, unseen visits home to Rome. Yeah, Mordecai, a Roman name if there ever was one. And he points to a temple on the next rise when Maximus asks him who made the deal with. So Mordecai basically he's the sheriff of this kind of limbo-y afterlife place. And in exchange for that, he gets to go to Rome and visit Rome as a ghost, essentially. And that will be important as the script goes on. And before Mordecai can say more, the crowd starts pushing toward the sea, which apparently, Elysium is apparently on the other side, according to their ramblings, and they watch as a boat with a single man on it disappears into the fog. And Maximus then departs, making his way towards the temple. And as he goes, Maximus spots a vendor who is the thief from earlier and has his breastplate in his stall. He takes his armor back and collapses the stall on top of the thief as he leaves, which is pretty fun. And he arrives at the temple, and Mordecai is already there, warning him to be careful in there as things are not what they seem. Inside, he finds 7 sickly old men who. It's not ever directly stated in dialogue, but it's pretty clear from the scene descriptions that they are the Roman gods Jupiter, Mars, Apollo, Neptune, Bacchus, Pluto, and Mercury. And so they initially mocked Maximus for seeking his wife and son, but then decide to strike a deal. One of their number, Hephaestus, has fled to the desert and started gaining converts, preaching that there is a greater power than them. This has led to their current condition, and Jupiter promises to reunite Maximus with his family if he finds and kills Hephaestus. Now that's an interesting detail here. All the other gods go under their Roman names, except for Hephaestus, who goes under the original Greek name. His Roman name was Vulcan. Also noticed so there's 7 in the room. There's Hephaestus, which makes 8. The 4 of the 12 Olympians are missing. And interestingly enough, the 4 that are missing are the goddesses. Now, are they already dead? Were they cast out? Not really addressed and not even brought up. I'm only noticing that and thinking about it because I know my mythology. But I am wondering if him having the Greek name is meant to be significant, or if Nick Cave just forgot the Roman name for Hephaestus. I mean, either one is possible. I'd like to think that he's somehow maybe returning to his true self with this new direction he's going. He's shed the Roman influence, maybe. But, that's all just speculation on my part. Maximus agrees and leaves the temple, where Mordecai tries to warn him that the gods lied to him and tells him that Maria struck a deal with the gods, exchanging her place in Elysium to give Marius another chance to live out his life on Earth, and that she could be anywhere now in this endless limbo. Mordecai follows Maximus as far as the edge of the desert, and from there he travels all alone. And this is just making me think of that sequence in the first movie where he's like riding like mad to get to his home and he gets there too late. Like he stops in the desert, he's like roasting some shit over a fire. It makes me think of that scene. One night, while sleeping, he dreams that Maria approaches him, asking him to help us. He awakes, but still hears her voice calling to him and sees a shape move quickly away. Maximus follows the voice to a thicket, cutting through it to find a wounded stag caught in the branches. It speaks in Maria's voice, saying, "Help us," again before dying. And that just makes me think of, I don't know how many of you have seen the Lars von Trier film Antichrist, but there's a scene in that film where Willem Dafoe finds a wounded fox chewing its own guts out, and then it opens its mouth and says, "Chaos reigns." This script would have come out before that movie, which is very interesting. That's a very fucked up movie, not one of my favorites by any means, but I do like that scene. That scene is nice and creepy. And this is just interesting. I'm wondering, and the whole symbolism, the whole image of the stag is something that recurs towards the end of this script, and once again, that's something I'll have to talk about there, and that the death of the stag and the significance of the stag, that's something that, I don't really fully grasp in the greater picture of it, but I will speculate about when we get to the end, because that's where it gets really kind of interesting and thematically heavy. And so Maximus continues his journey through the desert and passes a group of naked men wearing masks, the leader wearing the stag's skin as a cloak. And this part makes me think of that scene in Conan the Barbarian where where Arnold is traveling to find Tulsa Doom, and he passes those guys they call the children of Doom, Doom's children in the narration. That's what they remind me of. And Maximus soon comes upon a crude shelter where he finds Hephaestus lying on a pallet, cadaverous and dying, with a cross made of sticks in his hand. And he tells Maximus that the gods are all dying because there is but one god who is above even them. And he said that, those men outside are his followers who deserted him, and they lost their faith. They wouldn't believe that there was more coming if they would just hold strong and all that. And then he also tells Maximus that his son Marius is in danger and grabs his hand, saying he will show him before his body convulses and his mouth opens in a silent scream, which is an incredibly creepy image. Maximus then emerges from the body of a dying man whose body is like arching similarly to what Hephaestus was doing in the town square of Leon, where a mob is massacring Christians. Now, emerging from the body of a dying man, apparently that was Ridley Scott's idea, because he was talking about around the time Alien Covenant came out. He was saying, "Yes, we know how, I figured out how to bring back Russell Crowe through the portal of a dying man." And as is standard with Ridley Scott interviews over the past 15 years or so, you're never quite sure what the hell he's talking about, but he's pretty much talking about this. It's just weird. I tried to imagine Nick Cave getting, maybe this is like a revision or something, and he gets a note from Ridley Scott going, "Have him pop out of a dying guy." I was like, what? And also, it's not clear what exactly is happening from where it is described. Is he like chest bursting out of the corpse, or is he like phasing out? It has to be the second one because there's all these other people around and nobody actually sees that. So is he like incorporeal, emerges from the body, and then he becomes visible? That has to be what it is, because nobody ever comments like, yeah, that dude fucking like burst out of a dude's chest like he was in fucking Aliens. And so the only man left beside Maximus is an old man named Polythnus, identified by the leader of the massacre, Lucius. Yes, it's that Lucius, as the Bishop of Leon. Maximus tries to protect the unarmed man, but Lucius, who seems to recognize Maximus, just beheads him, ordering his soldiers to take care of Maximus as he leaves. And Maximus just fights them off, stealing one of their horses and fleeing. So that's another beat from the first movie where he kills all those Praetorians and then steals their horse. He kills Tony Curran, of all people, in that scene, and then steals a horse and then flees. And so outside that city that night, he is recognized by two young Christians who take him to Irenaeus, who is an actual historical figure. Don't know if Polythnus was, but I do know Irenaeus is, who is the new bishop. He wrote a book called Against Heresies. I know a little bit about history. He asks if Maximus is one of them and asks for his help in warning Cassian, a school teacher and their leader in Rome, that Lucius will be heading there next. And Maximus refuses, asking why they do not fight, telling them that their faith in the better life beyond this one is misplaced. And we then go to Lucius, who's talking to the consul of Leon, who's like unhappy with all the recent breaking of the peace and all that Lucius has been doing. And so Lucius is like, fine, I'll be going for Rome soon. And so elsewhere, Maximus camps by the road to Rome. He dreams of his son in the wheat field again, who is startled by the sound of approaching horses. So reminiscent of his son getting run over by horses in the as you see in the first movie. And then Maximus is awakened by the sound of actual horses, which belong to Lucius and his men as they pass by on the road to Rome. So this is one of the big problems I have with this script, is it tends to repeat itself a lot. We just got 3 separate scenes establishing that Lucius is leaving Leon and heading to Rome. We got Irenaeus talking about it, Lucius talking about it, and then Maximus waking up and seeing him ride by. You could have just had him ride by. And the whole thing about warning Cassian is kind of pointless anyways, because Maximus is just one dude. Of course, Lucius is going to beat him to the punch. It just seems very strange. And so Maximus continues on his way, where he comes across a blood-covered young girl in the wheat field, because he stops in the wheat field, does that thing he does in his dreams in the first movie where he's like gently stroking the wheat. He starts doing that for no reason, and then this girl pops out. And so he follows her, finding some frightened farm workers and a butchered Christian family by a river, including a dead baby and a raped daughter who has been left alive. And there's like a sheet hanging, I think it's like a sheet or a banner hanging from a tree with the red fish symbol of the Christians painted on it. And I thought they used the fish symbol so that the Romans wouldn't know what it was, but in this script they very much know what the fish symbol means, so that's a thing, I guess. And then from behind that sheet, there appears Mordecai, who tells Maximus that time runs differently in the other world, and that his son is now a young man and also a Christian. He also informs Maximus that the gods are angry with him and have decreed that he can never return to the afterlife, which suits Maximus just fine, because he's like, hey, my place is here. Now, I have to wonder how they're able to do that, considering they're supposed to be sickly and kind of losing their powers, but maybe I'm trying to add too much logic to this weird-ass plot. And so later, Maximus comes upon a plague-stricken village, and Mordecai appears again, opining about the beautiful nature of mortal life, and that it's beautiful because it ends, which kind of similar to a speech in Troy that Brad Pitt has, come to think of it. And Maximus is able to pass straight through the village with no worries, as he is already dead and can no longer die. And he locks eyes with an emaciated child, like he's clearly thinking about his dead son here. And there's also a scene, which I don't think I wrote it down, but he's on the road to Rome, and he comes across like an animal merchant who's like, caravan has kind of like tipped over or something, and there's like a dead rhinoceros by the road. The rhinoceros is something that was supposed to be in the first movie. In fact, they even shot like tests of the special effects, but the CGI was bad, so they scrapped the idea and replaced it with the tigers, which were also a pain in the ass for different reasons, but they worked out. And Scott must have just been thinking about that damn rhino the whole time because it's in this, and it ended up in the actual Gladiator too. Funny how that works out. And so Lucius soon arrives in Rome and his retinue. I use some big words in my notes sometimes. Passes the schoolhouse where Cassian is teaching. So yeah, this whole idea of like, oh, he needs to be warned that Lucius is coming. Like Lucius walks through the fucking gate and immediately Cassian knows about it. The students, who all seem to hate Cassian for no real reason. It's never really because nobody really knows he's a Christian until later. Everybody seems to fucking hate this guy though, and it's never established why. In fact, I'm just gonna leave it. But they all seem to hate Cassian, abandon their studies to watch the soldiers arriving, except for Marius, who calls Cassian father. So Cassian has raised Marius here. We'll get the full story later as to why. Maximus also arrives in Rome pretty soon after and makes his way to an inn where he pushes past drunks, who these drunks are surprisingly important, to secure a room. He also asks the innkeeper for information about Cassian, because there's only one Cassian in all of Rome, apparently, who tells Maximus where the school teacher lives. And there's a thing that the script does where it will say, like, first name, it'll give them the first name, and it'll say last name in parentheses. And here it says, he lives on the street Via, and then parentheses, because I guess Nick Cave in the moment didn't want to come up with Latin names for things. But he tells where the school teacher lives and mentions that he's not well liked in Rome, but Maximus walks away before he can hear the rest of the story. So we never find out why people don't like him. And so Lucius meets with Emperor Decius, this is one of the best characters in the script because he's just a nutcase, who is busy trying to feed bread and milk to a sick and blind pet, Spider Monkey. He's not pleased with Lucius's actions, as he merely ordered him to subdue the Christian leaders in Leon and bring them back to Rome, and he intimates that Lucius is only so brutal because it's something to do with his mother Lucilla having sympathies with the Christians. So yes, this is Lucius Verus, the little boy from the original Gladiator, and he's the villain of this story, and I actually really like that idea, because I'll talk about it a little bit more later, but you see the fact that he does have admiration for Maximus, but he also has a relatively close relationship with his uncle Commodus, who is the evil villain of the piece. And so I think it's an interesting direction to have him lean more towards that angle because of the stuff that happens to him throughout his life. And there's little moments here and there, one of which I can think of specifically that calls back to Commodus in an interesting way. And for his part, Lucius talks about how the empire is in a bad state and attributes it to the gods being displeased with Christianity's rise. And he actually, in this scene, this happens a couple times, he refers to Christians as being atheists, which I don't know if that was an actual thing the Romans called them, or if that's just something Nick Cave is trying here. I don't think that's what atheism is, my guy. But it's an interesting quirk in this script, nonetheless, because it comes up again later on. And so Decius then tells Lucius of his plan. He's going to announce an edict, which is requiring all people in Rome to make a sacrifice to the gods, and all the people who do it will be marked down in a census. And since the Jews are exempted, but the Christians aren't, so this will expose the Christians for who they are. And then he'll go after all of them in one quick swoop, apparently. So Decius is a nutcase, but he's a thinking nice, interesting guy. And so Lucius is like, well, I know one thing. Your monkey is dead, so sadly the blind, sickly monkey doesn't even survive his scene. The local Christians all meet at Cassian's house, concerned about the edict, some of them wanting to fight back despite Cassian insisting they are men of peace, and Maximus soon arrives, telling them of the slaughter in Leon. He mentions being a Roman soldier, and Marius, not recognizing his father, tells him off for serving the devil. And so Maximus goes to a temple to the Roman gods with statues of them in direct contrast to their actual state in the afterlife, so they're all fit and handsome and in good shape, etc. And Mordecai appears again, telling him that Hephaestus must have had his own reasons for sending him here, but Maximus only cares about his son not recognizing, which Mordecai just takes as a matter of course. Now, this whole thread of Hephaestus must have had his reasons for sending you here, that's something that is intriguing, but I don't think it ever gets tied off again, because, like I said, my theories to do with the ending of this script kind of maybe Hephaestus means for all this stuff to happen, but I'll have to talk about it later because it really won't make any sense until I get there. But he was on the outs with the gods, and then Maximus was supposed to kill him. He's doing something he's sending him here to do something that maybe the gods would approve of. It's a little unclear, probably on purpose. So Maximus then returns to Cassian's house and speaks with him, learning that Marius is his adopted son, and says he wants to help Cassian with a sword if need be. And when Cassian refuses, insisting he is a man of peace, Maximus calls him out, asking if he wants to lead Marius to the slaughter. So yeah, we kind of just repeated a scene again. He goes to talk to Cassian, gets told off, goes back when there's less people there, talks to Cassian, and then tells him off. It's not as bad as some of the other examples in this script, but like this whole conversation of, but we are men of peace, but really you should fight, but we've turned the other cheek. Ha, that's stupid. Happens like 3 or 4 times. And it gets exhausting after a while. So Maximus returns to the inn, where some of the drunks seem to recognize him, but not all of them believe it. And in the crowd is Juba, his fellow slave and gladiator from the original film, who gets that great little ending scene. And then he meets with Maximus in his room. And they walk to Juba's place as Maximus explains his return. And he literally tells him everything, going by the way he reacts to it. And so Juba then Juba explains he now has a wife and 2 daughters in Rome. And he's like, oh yeah, she apparently was quite taken by me when she saw me in the arena, and she sought me out after I was freed. And I'm like, you go on this whole thing in the original about how you want to go, about how like you left your wife behind in Numidia or wherever, and like I guess you don't want to go find. Yes, you don't miss her that much, do you? Like, first hot Roman bitch to come your way, you're like, hey, where are the white women at? It is pretty funny, but I do like some of the dialogue here, and so he now runs a blacksmith shop. He runs a forge. And so Juba gives Maximus a bundle with the figurines of his wife and child, which he retrieved from the Colosseum when he got word that the Emperor planned on flooding it to attract bigger crowds. So that's a neat little callback to that moment in the original, that he went and got those for him. That was cool. I like that little tie-in. And so then Juba's wife Camilla enters the room and goes like, it's late. Maximus should leave and you should come inside. And Maximus is looking at Camilla, looking at Juba, and he's like, nice work. Pretty funny moments like that. Nice little human moments for the character, so he's not just like a moody, growly asshole the whole time. So Maximus returns to the inn again, starts to pray over the figure of his wife, but breaks down crying because he knows the afterlife is kind of a sham now. And we then go to Lucius's home, where he's sitting on a balcony. There's a young girl sitting on the edge of his bed inside, but he's on the balcony sitting at a table. And he has his finger on the handle of a knife and he's spinning it. That's almost exactly the same as something that Commodus was doing with his sword in the Senate scene in the original movie. So you see he's taking after his other influence. That's smart. That's a good character beat. So the next day he mounts his horse and brings 2 guards with him as he heads off into the city. And outside the schoolhouse, Sardis, who's like the lead asshole student in the school, and 3 other students attack Marius in the street, only to stop when Maximus shows up and breaks Sardis's nose. And we then go back to Lucius, who's intimidating a Christian family, giving his knife to the young boy to poke at his father until the mother gives up that Cassian is their leader. And that's a pretty tense scene, because the kid has no idea what's actually going on. He goes, here, take this, just go, ch-ch, like playfully attack him. And it's like, and the mother and the father are just terrified. It's a well-written scene. Maximus helps Marius with his wounds at Cassian's house, and they discuss his beliefs. This includes a recounting of Peter and his sword at Gethsemane, about how Peter chopped the guy's ear off, and then Jesus told him that, those who live by the sword shall die by it. And they talk about, Christ only preached that violence only leads to more violence. And Maximus then talks about how his son also had a stubborn streak and was killed when he was 7, which Nick Cave gets that age right, because in the first Gladiator, Maximus and Lucilla say that both their sons are nearly 8. And then in the actual Gladiator 2, they fuck it up by saying Lucius was 12 at the time of Gladiator 1. Oops. And he even tells him the boy's name was Marius. And Marius is kind of looking at him, kind of wondering. And that's when Cassius arrives and Maximus excuses himself. Mordecai then appears and talks to him in the road, intimating that Marius is being won over to spite himself. Maybe you shouldn't be doing this, Maximus. Maybe listen to the immortal ghost man. Before asking if Maximus will be attending the game. And so we then go to Lucius, who meets with Decius in his private zoo. So once again, we have Decius, obsessing over his animals. Once again, this is something that we repeat. This same conversation repeats 3 times. But like all the animals look sickly and wretched. His giraffe was apparently struck by lightning and killed during the night. And you have like his servants all wheeling out the giraffe corpse on a cart. Like this is pretty good black comedy here. The Decius scenes, despite being repetitive, are some of the best. And Lucius is like, hey, I know the Christian leader is, but Decius wants him to wait for the edict. However, he relents and grants him permission to arrest Cassian, but only arrest him. And then also goes, hey, are you attending the games? He goes, of course. And so meanwhile, Maximus is helping Juba at the forge, who has gotten an order for 100 pairs of leg irons. And there's an interesting moment where they talk about how like they both still have the scars from the leg irons they wore as slaves. And Juba says, well, money is money. Interesting little character beat. It doesn't really go anywhere, but I think it's an interesting moment. And so Maximus tells him about Marius, and Juba, much like Mordecai, also says, hey, let your son lead his own life. And then over breakfast, Cassian recounts the story of how he found Marius as a 7-year-old boy. Did I skip something? No, I didn't. Okay. So over breakfast, Cassian recounts the story of how he found Marius, a 7-year-old boy wandering through a group of people dying of pestilence, looking for his mother. He then tells Marius to hold true, which his son doesn't quite understand. And then we go to Cassius teaching his students about Horus when Lucius and his men burst in. Lucius shoves Cassian down into his seat and rips his robe open, removing a fish symbol from around his neck. And he goes on a rant blaming the horrid state of the empire on Christianity. And when Cassian says he knew Lucius's mother and that she is with God now, he stabs Cassian in the throat with his own pen, and then Sardis and the students all follow suit, just stabbing him with pens, because, of course, the pen is mightier than the sword, as Marcus Brody would have you know. Marius flees into the streets, pursued by Lucius's men, who eventually catch him in a garden square. Maximus appears and kills the guards, slipping away into the city just as Lucius arrives and gets a glimpse of them as they flee. And Mordecai, who is lurking on a nearby bench, comments on the situation with, oh dear. So if you're counting, this is the second time Maximus finds Marius in the streets getting accosted by toughs and then helps him out, repeating the same scene twice. Maximus has taken Marius to Juba's forge, where the young man is distraught over the fact he didn't help his father. He flees, returning to the school where he watches his father's body get carted away, and so that he then returns to the forge. He goes to the forge twice and asks Maximus to help him and his fellow Christians, to which Maximus says he can only teach them to fight. And that evening, Lucius looks over his collection of weapons, and he comes to Maximus's breastplate displayed on a bust and stares at it. Now, that is interesting. That opens up like a metaphysical question here. Maximus has like, I guess, an afterlife copy of his breastplate, and I guess he still has it? I'm not clear on that part. But yeah, this is setting up that Lucius Verus he still has this connection to Maximus despite having gone down the other path. So Maximus has taken Marius to... I'm being stupid. The next morning, Maximus and Marius leave the city after threatening a horse trader and head to a farm where they're met by James and Justin, 2 members of the Christian community. Basically what they do is they go to the stable where the horse Maximus stole is being kept. And the guy's like, no, I'm going off to the games. And Maximus is like, just fucking open the gate and let me take my horse. And I'll take one for this kid too. And the games have started at the Colosseum, with a massive naval battle taking place in the flooded arena of gladiators and captive Christians alike, dying both from the battle, which includes flaming shit being thrown from like catapults and flaming arrows and stuff, as well as the hundreds of alligators that are let loose in the water. And so there's just constant descriptions of people getting set on fire, stabbed, shot, torn apart. And once again, this naval battle, it feels like something that was always going to be in Gladiator 2, no matter what the version was. So I'd be curious to see some of those other Gladiator 2 scripts that were written over the years to see if they have the Colosseum naval battle in it. Now, this is something they actually did do, but from what I understand, historically speaking, they may have only done it during the opening ceremonies, and then later on, like, they replaced it with, like, stuff that was, like, under the sand in the floor, so they couldn't have flooded it anymore, is my understanding, but it's cool for the movie. And so Lucius approaches Decius, telling him that the Christians are rising up, citing the 3 guards Maximus slew as proof. And Decius is like, the Christians rising up? It's them talking about the whole Christian situation again. And finally the conversation budges, because Decius agrees to hand over the names from the census that's coming up, which is occurring within 20 days. And Lucius then tells the Emperor about how Maximus is helping the Christians, which spooks Decius as both of them were there in the arena and watched him die. And Mordecai is like sitting there to the side of Decius listening in. And back on the farm, Maximus tells James and Justin that the Christians have little choice but to fight or die, and asks how many of them there are. Back at the fort, and like this scene goes on. He's like, "How many of you are there?" Blah 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 blah. How many? Blah 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 blah. How many of you are there? And it just stops in the middle of the scene. And so back at the forge, Maximus, Marius, and Juba make weapons for the Christians. Mordecai appears again, telling Maximus he will haunt him until eternity itself has said its prayers. So Maximus is indeed immortal. He is a Highlander by this. Maximus and Juba take the weapons out to the farm where they train 200 Christians in the art of combat. Meanwhile, Lucius is bathing at a brothel when one of his men reports in, saying he knows where they have been hiding. He turns up at Juba's forge when the blacksmith is alone, who at first mistakes him for Maximus. And so Maximus himself is on his way there when Mordecai appears, telling him that the whole of Rome now knows he's back. So those 2-3 drunks somehow spread the word to absolutely everybody off screen. And he warns him to beware. He enters the forge where he's confronted by Lucius, while 2 of the guards hold Juba up by the neck with the forge's chain, using him as a hostage to ensure their leader's safety. He doesn't understand how Maximus could be back and is especially confused as to why he assists the Christians, because in his view they stand against everything he fought. And we get the story of how Lucius turned out like this, and he has a pretty good speech which I'm just going to read out, because I think it's good enough that I don't think my notes could really do it justice. And Maximus says, "I knew your mother well. She was a good woman. It would appear that she gave birth to a snake." Again, Lucius waves away Maximus's retort. "A good woman, yes, but a vulnerable. After you died, Maximus, she lost heart. She became remote, distant. They preyed on her, these Christians. They lured her in. They poured their cup of poison into her ears, filled her poor mind with their foul notions of glory through martyrdom. She was set upon by a mob and stoned to death. My good mother. She knelt in the dirt, wrung her hands, and flung her empty prayers to the stars. Meanwhile, the mob tore her asunder. These fanatics that you abet, that you protect, Maximus, they cheered her on. She worshipped you." Lucius smiles sadly, "As did I." I'm going to finish this scene, actually, because I like it. Maximus and Lucius stare at one another. "And what now? Are we fated to do battle, you and I, we who are so alike?" Maximus stares at Lucius. "We are not alike, and fate has no part in this. I will see you again in this life." Lucius nods. "I think so." Lucius waves his hand. "Farewell. Go to your friend, Ghost." I really like that speech. I like this background for him, that he has this, his mother becomes a Christian convert, and he believes that she was taken advantage of by basically a cult in her moment of grief, and that drove her to her death, and that led him down this path that, like, I guess he felt like he had nothing left but to embrace what he learned from Commodus. It's good. Like, it's good, right? Which makes me wish the script as a whole was a little bit stronger, because there's a lot of just kind of like repetition, scenes that kind of just sit there, dialogue that comes up again and again, and just unclear ideas. That scene is so good. And Lucius and his men leave, letting Juba go unharmed as well. Interesting he lets Juba live. That's an interesting moment there, because it shows that maybe he also remembers Juba from before as well. That kind of gets fucked up a little bit later, but we'll get to it. Maximus, Juba, Marius, and the other Christians confer at the farm, and with the sacrifices coming up soon, they make plans for all of the Christian families to leave the city and go into hiding, while their makeshift army gathers in the woods outside Rome. Now, it's a little bit comical how little is explained here, where Maximus is like, "Do we have somewhere where the families can go?" And they go, "Yes," and then that's where they leave it. They don't explain what they're doing. They just have a convenient hiding place, maybe in the catacombs. And sure enough, when the day of the sacrifices comes and the census is taken, Lucius and his men find that all of the Christians have fled their homes, and a man named Paulus tells Lucius that the Christians are hiding in the nearby woods, and he then visits Decius again, getting permission to gather an army to stamp them out for good. And the evening before the battle, Marius tells Maximus about the talk going around among the men, that he has a famous gladiator returned from the dead, and Maximus says to let them believe what they will, and Marius asks him what he believes. Maximus then talks about his time as a soldier, how he believed he would be with his family again, and he feels them with him now. Paulus arrives and tells him that the Romans will be coming in the morning, and Maximus suggests Marius get some rest. And as he drifts off, Marius mentions that his real father was a soldier too, and that he never knew him because he was always off fighting. That's an interesting wrinkle to add, because you don't really get their relationship at all in the original movie. The fact that his son, he's been at war for a long time, and his son is now nearly 8. It's unclear how much time he has actually spent with his son. I like that that's there. Also, I like this moment because it feels like when he's off his guard, Marius kind of remembers a little bit more. Like that whole scene, the whole scene that was described by Cassian, where he says that Marius was wandering among the plague victims looking for his mother, which would suggest that when he first came back to Earth, he remembered his mother. He remembered it at least a little bit, and that as he spent more time there, he forgot. But now that he's around Maximus and he's off his guard, he's kind of drifting off and falling asleep, that a little bit creeps back in there. That's a neat little implication. The next morning, Lucius leads the army out of Rome and the Christians pray to prepare for the battle. Juba elects to stay and fight, even though he doesn't have to, so he can help his friend. That's a nice little moment between those two characters, which is strengthened by that friendship in the original movie. Maximus then catches a glimpse of a stag moving through the woods nearby. Lucius then leads the army into the woods where the Christians ambush them with arrows before attacking, and so we get this long bloody battle that ensues, which is basically described as a bunch of people fight and die, and it's not really described in any detail, which I do appreciate because sometimes a detailed battle scene is good reading, sometimes it's just like, God, get to the point. And in this particular script, just glossing over it and saying, oh yeah, we'll have a battle in this scene, works fine. So there's great losses on both sides. Juba is killed by Lucius, who slits his throat moments after Maximus saves him from being overwhelmed by 3 soldiers at once. So, bye, Juba. I'm glad you survived the first movie, just to forget about your wife, marry another woman, and then die randomly here in the woods. And so Maximus chases after Lucius on horseback, and this is a pretty cool little scene. Marius follows Lucius's horse, stumbles, and throws him. Maximus dismounts to fight him. To have a bit of a hand-to-hand combat, he wounds him in the arm and disarms him. And Lucius is like, yes, only by your hand. But then Marius actually delivers the killing blow by shooting Lucius with an arrow to the throat. And Lucius is like, what the fuck just happened? And then dies. Marius, covered in blood, drops the bow and falls to his knees after looking at the mess of bodies, both Christian and Roman, asking, what have we done? And James then appears, also covered in blood, but pumped up from the fight, saying the Romans are retreating, and Maximus says they'll be back and that we have to regroup and keep fighting. And okay, so I'm just going to read the ending, and I'm going to get into my speculation here. And so James departs, leaving Maximus and Marius alone in the clearing. That's when the stag, wounded with arrows in its neck and sides, staggers into the clearing. We then get a scene of Maximus fighting in the Crusades, untouched by the battle. Back to the stag falling to its knees. Then to Maximus fighting on a snowy, more modern European battlefield. Now, he doesn't specify how modern, so this could be anything from between the Crusades and the next one. I like to think it could be Napoleon's army in Russia, because that could be Ridley Scott revisiting his duelists territory. You know, that's not specified. Back to the stag falling on its side and moaning. Then to Maximus fighting in Europe amongst tanks and automatic weapons, probably World War II. Back to the stag, its eyes roll back as it dies. Why did I write does? You're an idiot, Bruce. Then to Maximus fighting in the jungles of Vietnam. Back to the stag, its open mouth lowing horribly. And that's the last we see of the Roman timeline. I'll talk about the actual ending in a minute. But I'll read the actual ending, then I'll talk about this. We then go to Maximus, washing his hands in the bathroom in the Pentagon. He sees Mordecai in the mirror, who repeats that he'll be with him until eternity itself has said its prayers. Maximus leaves the bathroom, walks down the hall, enters the war room where there's no fighting allowed, sits down at the table with 10 other men, saying, excuse me, gentlemen, now where were we? And that's where it ends. Crazy fucking way to end a script, especially Gladiator 2. What's interesting about it is I kind of have to speculate as to what all this actually means. Now, the whole Christ Killer subtitle comes into this, so I think what that means is that it's more symbolic of them teaching the Christians to fight, getting them to fight this battle, and seeing that James specifically is like really into this and like wants to keep fighting, and like he really is, excited about fighting and winning the battle. Well, whereas Marius, who really is the symbol of innocence here, is covered in blood and is completely just broken by it all. suggests to me that what is really killed here is the Christ-like nature of Christianity, and that the more bloodthirsty elements that come in later, with stuff like the Crusades, the Inquisition, Maximus basically corrupts Christianity in this moment and kills the ideals in a sense. And that's something that, like, I mean, and I've thought about that for years, ever since I read this. And then recently, the Best Movies Never Made podcast did a 2-part episode on this, and they said a similar thing, which makes me feel kind of validated. I'm like, oh, so I'm not just bullshitting. Like, that actually does seem to be like a legit interpretation here. And then there's other things here which are kind of interesting. So did Hephaestus mean for this to happen? Is that what? Oh, Hephaestus had his reasons for sending you here. Is that what that meant? And the only reason I can know why Hephaestus, who was a Christian convert, would want to do this is because he's despairing because his own converts turned away from him and went pagan again and were wearing animal skins and shit. So is that it? Is that what's going on there? Also, the visions of his wife and child from the first movie, which were supposed to be him reuniting with them at the end, they're false here, and he still has those visions. They take on a darker tone. Are we supposed to think that they were sent to him on purpose to send him on this driving quest and ultimately cause this? I don't know, but it's a possibility. I find that very interesting. But no, this whole idea, and then the stag, his wife turned into a stag and then died. She died, and then the stag dying next to his son, where his innocence has died, symbolizes, the good part of his son, the good part of Christianity is dying. I think that's all a really interesting idea, and that this whole, even though it's already established that Maximus is immortal, is going to live until eternity has said its prayers, that he essentially has doomed the world to this state of war after war that it's been in ever since. That's sort of what it's saying as well. That's a really interesting idea, too. I just wish it was a little bit clearer in terms of the narrative, but you see, this script, I'm glad I reread it and did the episode, because I resisted doing this for a long time, because I remembered thinking, like, the really interesting parts are at the beginning and at the end, and the rest is just the same old Romans versus Christian storyline you've seen in a million Sword and Sandals movies over the years. When really there is interesting stuff going on here. It's just, it gets kind of repetitive in the middle. They repeat the conversation about turning the other cheek so many times. Every scene between Lucius and the Emperor, although they're more interesting, it's the same conversation almost every time. We had 3 scenes establishing that Lucius was returning to Rome. I don't know if there was ever another draft written of this version, like a second or third, before it was rejected. I don't know, but it'll be interesting to see if maybe it got a little clarified, a little refined, see what went on in it. But no, I'm glad it wasn't made, mainly because I feel like I liked how the ending of the first movie plays out. I think that's a perfect ending of him reuniting with his family in the afterlife, although something I didn't pick up on until the last time I watched it. I watched it literally the night before I went to see Gladiator 2. He literally is about to, like, leave. He literally is about to die and go be with his family. He gets interrupted, like, twice. It's hilarious. Like, the Praetorian guy is like, Maximus, wake the fuck up. And then Lucio's like, Maximus, I gotta say one last word to you. And he's like, ah, damn it. But no, I mean, I think that ending is so good. I feel like this version of it, as much as I've kind of grown to appreciate this script, it kind of, it undoes that and kind of, like, thumbs its nose at it in a way where, like, I feel like that ending works better just left as it is. And even though I'm not a huge fan of the Gladiator 2 that we have, I think it's better off for not doing this, to be blunt. But yeah, so the reason why this didn't happen, apparently, there's been a couple of different reasons given. I know Ridley Scott said, like, oh, bringing Maximus back was like something Russell Crowe really wanted to do, but nobody else was really that interested in it. And then the story Nick Cave tells that he writes the script, shows it to Russell Crowe, and Russell Crowe says, don't like it, mate, and that was that. I would imagine there was a little more going on there. And so what's weird is that Gladiator 2 kind of goes away for a little while after that. Paramount buys up the old DreamWorks library, and then it's not until, and then Ridley Scott doesn't really start talking about Gladiator 2 again, at least the way I remember it, until around the time Covenant was coming out, and he did that interview where he talked about the portal and all that. And then 2018, they're like, oh, we're going to get Peter Craig to write the script. And then they farted around with that, couldn't get it to work, and then eventually Ridley gets his new favorite writer, David Scarpa, to do a draft of it, and goes like, oh, he figured it out by making it focus on Lucius, which is hilarious to me because that was the original idea way back in 2002. Like, yeah, you spent 20 years just to come back around to the idea you had in the first place. That will never not be funny to me. But it's But overall, Gladiator 2, it's an interesting script. I'm glad I reread it. I'm glad I did the episode. And I'm glad I spent so many years fucking thinking about it too, because that made it a more interesting experience. Because going into it blind, you're like, huh? But no, it's something where it's like, I'm not like super upset this didn't get made, but I'm glad the script exists as an interesting what if. And I actually think I'm glad that like a weird take like this was actually developed and that they thought about it and then didn't do it. I find that interesting in itself. So yeah, guys, that's Gladiator 2. Hope you enjoyed the episode, and until next time, bye.